that's kind of nice to meet old friends again, and very nice to, of course, to be here with all of you. And I just came in this morning, and so far I have seen the airport. Airports are airports, right? It's the same everywhere. It's not that interesting. But then I came here, and I thought, wow, this is a very beautiful place. Yeah, there's building here and the grounds around it and everything. Yeah. And I have to admit, when I first wrote to John and I said, well, I'm coming to the US, would you like me to come and give a talk at the Theosophical Society? I Googled it up and I looked at this building. I thought, wow, that's really, really cool. I'd really love to give a talk in this place. And now I'm here. So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing that you have going here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the fundamental aspects of the Buddhist teachings. It is a title about secular Buddhism because one of the kind of problems in the modern world, and one of the problems with the Buddhist teachings, some aspects of Buddhism are more easily acceptable by Western society in general than other aspects. But some of the aspects that have been kind of left out by our Western society are actually fundamental to what Buddhism is about. Yeah, there's too much of this thing of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Keep the baby. Yeah, the baby is important. Get rid of the bathwater, of course. But we have to keep those things that actually are core aspects of the Buddhist teachings. Otherwise, we lose the whole purpose of what this path is about. So this is really what I'm going to talk about tonight, some of these fundamental things and how we have to be very careful when we take on board these ancient spiritual and philosophical traditions coming from Asia, coming from abroad. And we need to look at them with an open mind. We should be careful to kind of be too narrow-minded, coming too much from, this is our Western worldview. We are right, of course, because we are Westerns, we're the most advanced countries, right? This is how we tend to think. This is always like that. People are hubristic across the board. But we have to be very careful with that. It's important to have a degree of humility because these are wisdom traditions. It's a different kind of advancement in culture than we have in the West. And we need to respect that in a very deep way. So I want to discuss this a little bit. So what is this thing that we call secular Buddhism? Why is it problematic? And what it is really, it is an idea that we will take the Buddhist teachings, and really you could call it secular spirituality. You could have this idea of secular for any kind of spiritual teaching, really. But my knowledge is about secular Buddhism, become very popular in the West. So the idea is, okay, we will take Buddhism, we will take those things that we can accept, and we will leave out those things that we consider the religious aspects. Religion is becoming a no-no, right? Especially when you come from a place where I come from, like Norway, no one is religious anymore. Christianity is out. It's finished. People are atheists or agnostics at best, not really interested in Christianity anymore. And I can see the same thing happening here in the US. There's more and more people who are not really aligned with any particular form of religion. So it's a tendency across the Western world moving away from religion. And so, in a sense, it makes sense that when we do that, we don't want to take on the religious aspects of another religion, right? That kind of is counterproductive. We're throwing out one and we're taking on something else. We then tend to approach the new things we take on with the same kind of mindset with which we rejected Christianity. In other words, we don't want the religious aspects of that teaching here. So, fair enough. I can understand why people do this. And I can understand why secular Buddhism has been very popular here in America, in Europe, across the Western world, precisely for this reason. It has allowed Buddhism, especially the early Buddhist ideas, to take hold in our societies. Without that initial rejection, perhaps it would have been more difficult. It had kind of been easy to welcome Buddhism, precisely because we have adapted it to what we feel is appropriate in the West. So secular Buddhism has had its place, and I want to recognize that before I start criticizing it. So easy to criticize, right? It's so easy to kind of think you know better, and I think it's important that we appreciate everyone and their contribution to what is happening here. And I really want to, and I mean that in a deep sense. I really mean an appreciation of what these people have done. They have done something positive. They have allowed these teachings to come into our society. But there comes a time when you have to, when things start to get established, when things become, when we start to kind of understand that actually we have only taken on part of these teachings, there comes a point when you have to kind of stand back a little bit and ask yourself, have we really accepted these teachings fully? Have we done the right thing by Buddhism? Have we thrown out too much of the teachings? So we actually have emasculated the teachings. They no longer have the power to lead to those things they are supposed to lead to. These are very important questions. And this is exactly what I think has happened with secular Buddhism. We have lost the very purpose for which the Buddha taught these teachings in the first place. We have lost the kind of the view of what actually these teachings are about. And so we need to rethink this whole idea of secular Buddhism, whether it really is a good approach. So to start off, actually I've started already, that's the wrong word, isn't it? To carry on, what I think it's good to take a step back and ask ourselves, well, what does secularism really mean? What is secularism about? Where does it originate? Where did it come from originally? And secularism, when you look it up on Wikipedia, that's kind of my source these days. Wikipedia, very, very, very easy. So you go to Wikipedia and it's secularism. It says, well, secularism was a movement, a counter movement to religion in Europe in the Middle Ages. The late Middle Ages, the beginning of the Renaissance period, say 16th century, around that time. And it was a counter-movement to the religions at that time. And the reason why it happened was because it became more and more clear that the religion of Europe at that time, basically Catholicism, was not capable of dealing with the modern world. It was incapable. Because why? Because it was rejecting truths that were becoming obvious. It was rejecting the Copernican revolution, the idea that the Earth goes around the sun. That was Copernicus, and then Galileo kind of carried on with that. And it was rejecting more and more things that science and society took as obvious. And so then they came up with this idea that actually what we need to do, we need to separate church and state. The state has to operate on truth. The state cannot operate on religious dogmas because then we're sticking our head in the sand. We have no idea what's going on. We have to, if you're going to run a society, it has to be run on realistic ideas. We can't just run it on dogmas and things that are completely untrue, right? So this is how secularism kind of came about. We have to run our society according to the real reality as we understand it. And so then religion was kind of given its own sphere. That's your sphere. You can kind of say what you like in church, but our societies are going to be run on a secular basis. So government became secular. And in that context, it made very good sense to have a secular government because you weren't really able to run society on the basis of those religious dogmas. And so that was kind of where it started. And I think sensible in many ways. But does it really apply to the Buddhist teachings in the same way? That is kind of my question. And that is a question we should ask ourselves. And it's important to understand where Buddhism comes from. It comes from a very different idea than many of the traditional religions of the West, Christianity or whatever. The Buddhist idea is not so much about holding on to a particular word of a particular god or anything like that. The Buddhist idea is about discovery. It's about understanding. It's about insight. It's about aligning our view with reality, not against reality. That's the whole point. And for that reason, when we talk about Buddhism, really the kind of wherever we find the truth in our society, whether it's through science, whether it might even be through philosophy. Philosophy is a bit more dodgy, but wherever we find the truth in our society, that should be acceptable to Buddhism. There shouldn't be any contrast, any contradiction between the Buddhist truth and any other truth, because we're searching for truth. What was that saying you had here again, John? Searching the truth.
There is no religion higher than truth.
Right, exactly, right? Yes, this is exactly what we're getting to, right? Truth is what we want to seek for. And if we reject truth, well, then we have a problem. And I think, what does Ajahn Brahm say? Ajahn Brahm, anyone heard of Ajahn Brahm here? Yeah, Ajahn Brahm, okay, good, yeah, okay. Actually, I should always ask, has anyone not heard of Ajahn Brahm? It's a much better question to ask usually. You get few hands that way, and he says something like, what does he say again about the truth and how does it phrase this again? I can't remember now. Something about never get your dogma, your views to stand in the way of the truth or something like that. In other words, views should be adaptable. The way we think about things should not be set in concrete. We need to take on the truth wherever it is found. And this is a beautiful way of dealing with reality here. And so because Buddhism is based on, at least theoretically, this idea that we are discovering truth, there shouldn't be any distinction between religion and the secular, right? The religion and secular should actually merge. And I think this is one of those very important things, that we have a tendency to divide things up in our society into different kind of spheres, different areas. And sometimes those divisions are not really valid. Yeah, we have religion over here, we have secularism over there, we have spirituality over here, and then we have kind of the secular government. But actually, these divisions are sometimes artificial, and sometimes they're not really required. And I think sometimes, if you have a real spiritual path that is actually searching with honesty for the truth, the whole division between the secular and the spiritual should really collapse. It should not need to exist anymore. And this is what I'm arguing here is also the reality for Buddhism. It should be a collapse, and there should be no need for secular Buddhism. There should just be truth, right? Truth is what really it is about. And so this is a very important point. Welcome. Yeah. And so one of the things that you often will find is that you will be accused as a Buddhist monk, or as a Buddhist perhaps as well, of having kind of metaphysical positions. Yeah, by metaphysical positions I mean like philosophical positions, or dogmatic positions about things. Yeah, you have a metaphysical position. There is rebirth, right? This is a metaphysical position according to a secular Buddhist. But actually, that is not really the Buddhist position at all. The Buddhist position is that these things are knowable. They're not things that actually come from a metaphysical position. It is not someone who sat down and thought, how does the world work? Rebirth makes sense. Okay, rebirth is the way forward, right? It's not like that at all. The idea from Buddhism, and this is kind of the fundamental thing here, is that these things are discoveries, When the Buddha says there is rebirth, he doesn't say that as a metaphysical or philosophical position. Buddhism is not a philosophy. I'll come back to that in a second. It is a discovery by the Buddha. And it is a discovery that is in principle anyone can make. I say in principle because it's not necessarily easy to do, but in principle anyone can do. So our claim is that this is reality. And because it is reality, when these people say, that's just a metaphysical position, no, that is a misunderstanding of where Buddhism is coming from. From inside of Buddhism, within Buddhism, these are truths that you discover. And for that reason, it should be compatible with the rest of the world. And I would argue that the idea that there is no rebirth, if you have a secular Buddhist who says without any doubt that there is no rebirth, that is actually the metaphysical position. I would argue, because there is no absolute evidence, there is no way you can know that there is no rebirth. That to me is a metaphysical position. I would turn things upside down. I would say that a secular Buddhist who denies rebirth, fair enough, not all secular Buddhists. Actually, are there any secular Buddhists here? I forgot to ask. I should ask these things first, because suddenly if you are very welcome to stay, right? I'm not gonna tear you apart, your doctrines apart, or anything like that. But it's always everyone is very welcome, and I do not mean to offend anyone. I just mean to discuss what I think is a very important topic. So. Some secular Buddhists, they reject rebirth outright. Not all secular Buddhists. There are some secular Buddhists say, we don't know, we are agnostic about this. And that I have no problem with. We are all going to be agnostic about these things, more or less, unless you have some very powerful insight in your meditation practice. So that's fine. But when you reject it outright, I would say that is actually where you take a metaphysical position. Because you're saying something is wrong when actually you cannot really know that. So I would turn things upside down. Instead of saying that the Buddhist who believes in rebirth has a metaphysical position, it is the secular Buddhist who rejects rebirth outright. That is the person who takes a metaphysical position. And in that sense, I have turned things upside down. This is what you will not normally hear anywhere in the world. But to me, that is closer to the reality than the other way around. And it has very significant consequences. I will just give you an example of what happens when you take a secular position. I'm going to come back to this in a second, talk more about ideas such as rebirth and karma. And I understand that actually these things are important in Theosophism as well. Yeah, I've read a little bit in those brochures he gave me just to get some idea. And it's said in there that rebirth and karma is kind of considered as background theories that you take on board. It didn't say believe, something that you kind of judge, you live your life by, or something like that. So these are ideas that I understand Theosophists have as well, and many, many people around the world have ideas about rebirth, and a future life and reincarnations. Many Christians have these ideas, Muslims have these ideas. Hindus certainly have these ideas. Atheists believe in rebirth, you know that. I used to be an atheist before I became a Buddhist. I couldn't believe in rebirth at that time, but many atheists believe it. So this is actually very, very common ideas around the world. But the point I want to make is that some of these secular Buddhists, when you reject this very fundamental and important teaching of rebirth, it actually means that you have to rewrite the Buddhist scriptures in a very fundamental way. And I will just give you one example of that. This is one of the most famous secular Buddhists in the world. I shall not name the person. You may not have never heard of this person anyway. But what he says that, well, the second... Have you heard about the Four Noble Truths? Yeah. Okay, so Four Noble Truths. Well, the second noble truth is about, the first one is about suffering. So it's about the problem of existence. The second one is the cause of suffering. Cause of suffering is craving, right? This is kind of the noble truths of Buddhism. And for him, this secular Buddhist, this is problematic, because what that noble truth is saying, craving is what perpetuates the round of existence, the rebirth cycle. He rejects rebirth. So for him, that whole thing is problematic. So what he says, instead of saying that craving is the cause of suffering, he says suffering is the cause of craving. He has just turned the Buddhist teaching upside down. And this is his version of the second noble truth. So what do you think? Is that valid? It's problematic, right? Because if you have some degree of confidence that the Buddha knew what he was talking about, and then you turn the whole teaching upside down, you have a very serious problem. And of course, once you turn it upside down like that suffering leads to craving, then the whole idea of how rebirth comes out of that equation or out of that causal connection, that is lost completely from sight and becomes impossible to really justify any rebirth in that kind of context. But is it true, though, that suffering leads to craving? Well, actually, it is true, right? And this is kind of what is interesting about this. So the point that he makes, that suffering leads to craving, is largely true, because, well, we know what it's like in our own lives. If you have a lot of suffering in your life, what you do, often leads to craving. If you are... very commonly people are depressed, they go to the fridge, right? And they kind of try to get out of the blues by having something to eat, or they go have some entertainment or whatever. And so suffering leading to craving, yes, there is some truth to that. So in a sense, he's making a point, and the point actually is valid, and the point does have a place on the Buddhist path, but it is not the second noble truth. This is kind of the important point here. And this is what I mean, that the moment you start to reject certain fundamental principles on the Buddhist path, you have to rewrite the whole teachings. And you end up not with Buddhism, you end up with the name of that person, ism. I'm not going to say the name, right? I think there's no need to say names, because whatever. So, but actually on that point, because, on that point about what to do when you're suffering, this is interesting. What do all of you do when you suffer? Do you have any kind of clarity what you do? Do you kind of go and watch a movie? Do you eat something? Do you go and cry on your bed? What do you do? Now, there was an interesting survey done, and that was done actually here in the United States. I think the University of Texas at Austin or something like that, one of the top universities here in the US. And they did a survey on what people do when they're kind of feeling a bit blue, right? So what do you do? And the standard things, I go to the fridge, I kind of turn on the telly, or this was in the days of the telly, now we turn on the internet. But yes, but then there was a small percentage of people, I think maybe 4% or something, and they said when they were feeling a bit depressed and feeling a bit bad, they went out and did an act of service. And I thought, wow, these people have really got it. Yeah, they have understood the way out of depression, out of sadness, out of a negative mind state in the right way. And this is such a beautiful example. And these, I think, are people who have a natural spirituality within them. Yeah, they understand how the mind works and how to get out of these things in a good way. And I was very uplifted when I saw that, because 4%, if you take the American population, how many people in this country? 380 million or something like that? Okay, I'm not going to make that calculation. 16 million people, maybe something like that, 4%. So that's a significant number of people, right, who have got it right. And I find that so uplifting, because sometimes when you look at the world and you see all the things going on in the world, the war in Ukraine and climate change and refugee crises and so many bad things happening in the world there. But actually, there's a lot of good things happening in the world as well. And sometimes we need to look for that. And when you see the goodness in the world, when you see that there's 4% of the American population who does an act of service when they feel bad, I mean, that's wonderful, isn't it? There's a lot of goodness in this world, and sometimes you just need to look for it. The other day I was in San Francisco. I just came from San Francisco a few days ago, and I was driving with this man, and we're kind of stopping at a petrol station. And a petrol station, it was this enormous highway, cars rushing by. It was kind of unpleasant environment, right? And I was just watching the people kind of going in and out of the petrol station, and people were just holding the doors open for each other, right? And I don't know if that's common in Chicago, but it was happening in San Francisco. Strangers, people you'd never met before, holding the door open for each other. I thought, wow, that's really nice. Would that happen in my country, Norway? Not so sure. But sometimes when you start looking, you see a lot of kindness in our society. People looking out for each other, and it's beautiful to see that. I just wanted to bring that in, because sometimes there are, these little things are actually what makes the spiritual life really interesting and very powerful. So anyway, so we have to be very careful with how we deal with these teachings, how we think about them. And we need to understand that secularism came about in a certain context, and it may not be applicable to Buddhism. And this is kind of the point I'm making here. But there's much more to it. And the other thing that is to it is that very often we don't really properly reflect on the social context that we live in here. Yeah, the social context that we live in today is a social context where we are materialistic. By materialist, I don't mean that we kind of like big cars and big houses. What I mean is we're materialist in a kind of scientific sense. Yeah, we call it physicalist, where we believe in matter in the world. We don't really believe in the spirit or the mind and these kind of things. Yeah, and that is kind of our social conditioning, to live in that materialist or physicalist outlook on the world. And the physicalist outlook is really the idea that material phenomena come first, and mental phenomena are somehow an emanation of material phenomena, right? And of course, once you have that materialist outlook, and if you take that seriously, and it's a very, very strong cultural conditioning in our culture, in the Western culture specifically. In Asia, it's quite different, but they too are affected by these things. Once you have that outlook, it has a very important effect on how you think about things like rebirth, and karma. How, if the mind is a epiphenomenon, a kind of emanation of material things, how can the mind go from one life to the next one? If the body dies, the mind is also going to be gone, right? When you die, everything is gone. That is the natural consequence of this materialist outlook. And so this is where these people come from, right? And this is why they don't want to have anything to do with rebirth, because they have this materialist outlook. But what we are forgetting, and I think this is the important thing, is that that is just our cultural conditioning right now. The idea of the materialist outlook in the world is not really a scientific outlook. It is a philosophical outlook. It is a way that we interpret the scientific findings that we've had over the past few centuries, and we interpret them through a materialist lens. And then we say the world is made of matter, right? Without really fully understanding what we're doing. And then we buy into that zeitgeist, this kind of worldview, this paradigm of things being material, without really thinking deeply enough about it. And this is really what is at stake, and this is kind of the real issue here. But once you start to look at the history of philosophy just a little bit, I'm not going to pretend to be, very well educated in philosophy. I'm actually an engineer by education of all things. But if you know a little bit about the history of philosophy, you don't have to know that much. You know that these ideas about whether we live in a materialist, a world that is fundamentally material, or whether we live in a world that is fundamentally mental, or we live in something in between, or a mix or a hybrid or whatever, these ideas are always changing, right? They are not stable. If you go back just to the 19th century and you look at some of the greatest philosophers in Europe at that time, Hegel, Kant, Schopenhauer, some of these very important philosophers, they were idealists. They said mind is primary, everything else is secondary, comes after mind. And that is only 150 years ago, right? It's very recent. And then there was a kind of change, a change in what they call paradigm, a change in worldview. And then the world became materialist somehow. But then you go back in time, and then you go back all the way back to the Greeks. And the ancient Greeks, Plato was an idealist, Aristotle was a materialist. Right? So you see this kind of movement back and forth between idealism and materialism has always been going on in the world. And sometimes we think that kind of the worldview that we have now, this is kind of the final worldview. But if you take a more humble approach, you actually realize, no, probably this is just the fashion of our times. We are now living through this fashion. And when you see it like that, you don't take these things so seriously. You take a step back and you start to think about this in a new way. And this is what this is about. And what is very interesting, actually I should mention here a very interesting book on the philosophy of science, which was called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by an American who lived back in the 1960s, I think, Michael Kuhn or something like that. No, not Michael, Thomas Kuhn. So, anyway, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, right? So this is what about the history or the philosophy of science. And what he was saying, and this is very relevant to what we're talking about now, is that the way that science progresses, you get trapped in what he called a paradigm. A paradigm is a particular outlook that you get trapped in. So, for example, in physics, you have the Newtonian physics, right? That was kind of the paradigm of physics until Einstein came about. And then Einstein changed everything with relativity. And then came quantum mechanics and all of these things. Each one of these is like a new paradigm. It's a new outlook, how to understand a particular thing. And he was saying that the way science progresses, you should get stuck in a certain paradigm. You stay in that paradigm with that outlook for a certain time, and then the evidence kind of gradually builds up that this paradigm has some weaknesses, right? It doesn't have all the answers, and the evidence builds up and builds up, until there's so much evidence that people can't deny it anymore, and then and then they come up with a new theory that fits the new evidence, and they have what they call a paradigm shift. You move from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, right? And you have a paradigm shift, a new world view, a new outlook, because the evidence has built up and you have new theories that fit with that new evidence. Now, right now, we are in the materialist paradigm. We have left the mind out. The mind doesn't really exist. The mind is a secondary phenomenon that comes from material things. When you think about it, it's really counterintuitive that the mind is secondary. Mind is what we know everything with, right? Mind is, to my mind, mind is to my mind, mind is primary, because this is how we know anything in the world. This is how we see, this is how we hear. And all our physical theories are really secondary developments from our perceptions and our view of the world. The mind, so the idea that the world is material and mind is secondary, actually is a very counterintuitive idea. It doesn't really make any sense. But we are trapped in that particular paradigm right now. And so this is why we have to be so careful. And what is very interesting in the times that we live in right now is that things are changing very fast. And there are people who are much more knowledgeable about this than I am, who are saying that we are on the verge of having a paradigm shift. We are moving, we have been trapped in materialism for so long now, for 100 years or whatever. We are on the verge of actually moving back to ideas where the mind is taken seriously again. And I just want to, you may think that I'm just saying this because I'm a Buddhist monk, right? But let me give you some examples of this, because once you have some examples and you see the kind of people who are involved in this, I think you will start to see that actually this is quite serious. This is not just some kind of make-believe, because as a Buddhist monk you have to believe this stuff. But one example is the philosophy department at New York University, supposed to be the best philosophy department in the world in terms of the quality of the philosophers and these kind of things. And one of the lead philosophers in that philosophy department is a fellow called David Chalmers, who is an Australian, by the way. He's an Australian fellow, and he, back in the 1995 or thereabouts, he talked about what is called the hard problem of consciousness. Consciousness cannot be explained in terms of material phenomena. And with that question, he started a quiet revolution in philosophy, and many other philosophers have come on board after that. And there is now this movement in philosophy that is actually taking mind seriously again. Until that point, it was assumed, in accordance with the paradigm that we are living through, that mind is secondary. Now, mind is taken seriously again within philosophy. So this is already very interesting, right? Because philosophers, actually, they do have an important position in our culture, because they are often drivers of the kind of thought leaders in our culture very often. And then you come to the sciences, right? Now, one of the very interesting articles, if you go to some of the most important scientific journals in the world, one of the most important ones is called Nature. You've heard about Nature? Yeah, very, very important. Probably the premier scientific journal. Well, there's one American one called Science. Nature comes out of the UK, but these are the two premier scientific journals in the world. In 2004 or 5 or whatever, there was one of the lead articles in Nature. This journal was an article by a very famous physicist from Johns Hopkins University here in the US called Richard. What was the name? Richard Conn, something. Okay, something had a name, but. And he wrote an article, lead article in Nature magazine, where he said that it's a time that we face up to the facts. The reality with quantum mechanics are so undeniable now that the only conclusion we can come to is that the world is mental. Lead article in Nature magazine by one of the most famous, Richard Conn Henry, I think his name was. These are some of the leading physicists in the world that also are starting to see that actually there is a revolution going on. We need a new outlook. We need a new paradigm to see things. A third example is a neuroscientist called Richard Koch. He's probably one of the world, maybe the world's leading neuroscientist, very, very famous, lots of papers and all of these kind of things. And he has become a panpsychist. This is only very, very recent in the last few years. And panpsychism is another way of kind of adding consciousness at the base of reality. So it actually becomes a fundamental part of the reality as we know it. So these are 3 examples of some of the leading philosophers and scientists in the present day. And there is a gradual movement in that direction happening as we're sitting here. There was another famous, maybe famous, but another philosopher who is leading kind of this idea of idealism, that the world is inherently mental. And he said that today, when we have debates, it is impossible to find someone who is willing to take the side of the materialist. In other words, to take the side of material things are the only thing that matters, everything else is secondary. It is impossible to find anyone who is willing to take that side. So we can't really have debates anymore. We're actually starting to move very strongly into a new way of looking at reality. And so this is fascinating, because what it means is that we have forgotten, people who are materialists have forgotten that actually so much of the things in our culture, they are fashions, they are fads, they last for a while. We are trapped in a certain outlook because we are trapped in these paradigms that exist. And because we are trapped in these things, we cannot see the alternatives. And that's why it is good to be humble. That is why it is good to take a step back and say, actually, maybe we don't know as much as we do. So we are, even though our Western culture is very advanced in terms of technology and certain scientific insights and all of that, there are other areas where we are probably far less advanced than some of the ancient civilizations. And I'm sure all of you would agree with that, like in spirituality and these kind of things. So it's good to take that kind of more humble and understand the limits of your own outlook and how we all are so conditioned and trapped in the social fabric of our times, and very hard to step out of that. And once you think like that, then things become possible that actually may have seemed impossible before. And so how do we decide then? If someone comes with an idea like rebirth, how do we decide? If we take a more humble approach and we realize that actually our culture, our scientific outlook, our current philosophies cannot really help us in this kind of thing, how do we make a decision? And for me, it is actually very easy. When I hear that the Buddha says that there is such a thing as rebirth, and the Buddha is by nowhere means the only one, lots of other people say this as well, but when the Buddha says this, and to me the Buddha is like, wow, the Buddha. The Buddha is like, the Buddha is to me, the kind of the greatest spiritual living genius, not living, the historical spiritual genius, in recorded history. He's like number one. There's no one like the Buddha. You start reading the suttas, start reading the word of the Buddha, it's kind of powerful stuff, and you see how it teaches things in a very systematic and gradual way, and then you start to practice a bit in accordance with that, you get some of the results. And the way the Buddha teaches in the early suttas, the way he talks about things, it is so systematic, it is so convincing. You don't really find any spirituality, I would argue, that is as systematic and as coherent as you find in the early suttas of the Buddha. That would be my argument. And people are very welcome to disagree with that, of course. So for me, the Buddha is extraordinarily special. And when the Buddha says that there is rebirth, and he doesn't just say this as a metaphysical reality, he says this is what I have discovered, how can I not take it seriously? How can I reject that as if it is irrelevant? If you meet someone, let's say that you met someone sitting here and they told you, looking you in the eye, there is rebirth. What are you going to say? Are you going to reject it? Or are you going to say, wow, this monk says that. Okay, maybe this monk, I'm not talking about myself, by the way. If someone says that, or a layperson, or whoever, if they say that, and they have a character that you feel you can trust, maybe you have watched them over a long period of time, they are someone with integrity, someone who's doing something very good in this world, and they tell you to your face that there is rebirth. It's hard to reject, right? And there is a lot of evidence in the world that points in that direction, not just from monastics, but often from people who have near-death experience and these kind of things. Have you heard about some of these near-death experiences? Have you heard there's a book came out recently called After? Have you heard about that book? You have heard? Okay, good. I would really recommend you to read some of this literature if you haven't. There's a book called After by a fellow called Bruce Grayson. He's probably the world's leading authority on near-death experiences. He's at the University of Virginia. I think he's emeritus now, but he used to be a professor there. And very powerful stories. When you read those stories from ordinary people having near-death experiences, it's incredibly hard to dismiss this as some kind of nonsense. He is an expert on these things. He has put all of these things to the test in various ways, and he has come to the conclusion something very interesting is going on here. So there's something powerful going on. And sometimes we think that just because the Buddha lived 2,500 years ago, we can somehow dismiss what he said. But actually the Buddha's testimony, to my mind, is just as powerful as the testimony that Bruce Grayson gives. Or if you find someone who can sit here and tell you there is rebirth, it is actually just as powerful. Why? Because the Buddha is clearly an historical character. He clearly said these things. He's someone who is very exceptional in so many ways. It comes through the word that he teaches. That sometimes we think just because it's 2,500 years old, we don't have to take it so seriously. We should. Yeah? This is kind of the point I'm trying to make. So when I read the word of the Buddha, and I say the Buddha says these things, this thing is actually, to me, is a very, very important piece of evidence that there is such a thing as rebirth. And people think I'm nuts when I say these things. People think I'm kind of taken by blind faith and being led astray by these scriptures that who knows where they came from. But I actually tend to think exactly the opposite. This, to me, is a very rational way of thinking about these things. So this is how I think about this. So why am I going on about the idea of rebirth so much? Why does this matter? I want to talk a little bit about that before time is up. And so I want to start, first of all, just giving you some idea of how integral it is to the Buddha's teachings, right? And then I will talk a little bit about why it matters for our ordinary practice as well. And this is just to make the point that we should take it seriously, because if we don't take it seriously, basically the Buddhist teaching falls apart. There is no Buddhism really without rebirth. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay. So what is some of the evidence? Well, the first thing the Buddha says, he says that the idea of rebirth is part of what he calls right view, right? What is right view? Right view is the outlook that we have on the world. The world functions in a certain way, and if we align the way we look at the world with the way the world actually is, that's called right view. Yeah, and it's a very simple idea. You know, if you want to travel here to the Theosophical Society and you don't know the road, and you go wrong and you end up in where can you end up? I don't know, anywhere around here. End up at the airport. I've been to the airport. You end up at the airport instead, right? That was because you had wrong view, because you didn't know where you were going. So wrong view is bad news, because wrong view leads you astray. Instead of coming here, sitting down, relaxing, hanging out with your good friends. We call them mates in Australia, but I know you probably don't understand that, so I say good friends. Yeah, so wrong view leads to a kind of suffering, because you would like to come here, maybe you'd like to kind of have some spiritual input in your life, whatever it is, and then end up at the bloomin' airport. Airport is not very interesting. Wrong view leads to suffering, because we make bad decisions when we have wrong view. In exactly the same way as it leads to bad decision in ordinary life, if you have wrong view, you think that this particular stock is going to do well, so you invest in a stock on the stock market. I don't know if any of you here are investors, maybe no idea, but if you invest on the wrong stock, you're going to lose your money. You get the right one, right view, you make money. So how we view the world, that we view the world in line with the way the world actually is very important. Otherwise, we're going to make bad decisions. And it's exactly the same thing on the spiritual path. If you think the world is a certain way, when the world is actually a different way, guaranteed, you're going to make bad decisions as a consequence. Rebirth is part of that, right? It's about the outlook, how we think about reality. And so the Buddha says this is right view. So straight away, it should matter. Yeah, we should take it seriously, because if we have wrong view, it's going to lead to problems. In Buddhism, we have what is called the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Path is that if you have right view, it leads to right intention. Yeah, the idea that you have right purpose is what I would maybe call it. You are purposefully living in a way based on the right outlook. Then your actions, your purposes become meaningful, and they're driving you in a good direction. Then you become moral, then you become kind, then you become someone who develops compassion and loving kindness in your life. Yeah, all of these things come from right view. Wrong view, wrong intention, you're going to go down the wrong track. So this is the first reason why it really matters, and that is really enough. Yeah, I don't really need to say anything more than that, but I'm still going to say more because I got a few minutes left. So the other thing is that one of the most important teachings of the Buddha is the Four Noble Truths. Yeah, I mentioned this before. The first noble truth is the noble truth of suffering. In the noble truth of suffering, the very first part it says is that birth is suffering. What does birth is suffering mean? Well, what it means is rebirth is suffering. That's what it means. Because remember, what we are trying to do in Buddhism, we're trying to overcome suffering. So if birth is suffering, the only birth you can overcome is future birth. So it must mean rebirth. Yeah. First noble truth. Second noble truth says that craving is the source of suffering. And that craving is specifically qualified as rebirth-leading craving, porno bhavika tanha. Are you impressed with that? Pali language, porno bhavika. I always put in a few Pali words because it gives you more authority when you do that, right? So I know how to kind of play the game. So just warning you. So porno bhavika means rebirth-leading suffering, right there in the second noble truth. Third noble truth then. Tassayeva tanhaya asesa viraga nirodha. It's even more Pali for you. That very craving, the remainderless fading away and cessation of that very craving, referring back to the craving of the second noble truth, which is rebirth-leading craving. Third noble truth is also about rebirth. Fourth noble truth is about the Noble Eightfold Path. First factor of the Noble Eightfold Path is right view. I just showed you before, right view has rebirth in it. So that too has rebirth in it. Every one of the Four Noble Truths has rebirth in it. People are not usually aware of that. Four Noble Truth is the overarching idea of the entirety of Buddhism. It is through and through about rebirth. Then we have dependent origination. Have you heard about dependent origination? Okay, this is one of those very kind of very subtle and deep ideas in Buddhism, often considered the most deep of all the ideas. That together with Nibbana, really. And dependent origination really is it's a formula which shows you, or it's a conditioned relationship that shows you how suffering arises from delusion. If we are deluded in the world, we will suffer. And it shows you in a sequence of 12 factors, 11 links, 11 causal links, how that suffering arises from delusion. One of the factors in there is rebirth. Rebirth is one of the causes that actually make this whole process work. If you take it out, you have to redefine, re-understand the whole of dependent origination, and you come up with ideas like it doesn't actually mean rebirth, it means like the mind who kind of changes and then kind of you get reborn in a new way, mental rebirth. But actually there's exactly zero evidence for that in the sutras, in the word of the Buddha. Then comes maybe some of the most important evidence of all. I mean, I've already said evidence that is so important, I don't know how it can be more important, but maybe it is more important still. And that is, what was the insight of the Buddha on his night of awakening? It is called the Te-vidya, the three knowledges. These three knowledges are also found in Brahmanism, in the ancient Advaita Vedanta or Brahmanical scriptures, and the Buddha used the same words in his teachings. He took some of those ideas and redefined them in a Buddhist way. One of them is the Te-vidya. What are these three knowledges? This is the knowledge that the Buddha acquired, according to Buddhism, on the night of his awakening. This is what basically his discovery is all about. Three things: rebirth, karma. This is also Theosophical kind of idea, karma. The last one is awakening experience itself. Awakening experience itself, what is that? The ending of rebirth. So rebirth, karma, which karma is really the driving force, the mechanism that makes rebirth work. And then the ending of the rebirth, which is the awakening experience. That is the insight of the Buddha on his awakening. It is all about rebirth. In fact, the purpose of the Buddhist path, and this comes out of this as well, the entire purpose of the Buddhist path is to end rebirth. That is what it is about. When you eventually become an arahant, fully awakened one, are you all heading there? Yes? Okay. Hopefully we're all going to see reality in a greater way. What do you see when you come to the end of the path, according to the Buddha? You see birth has come to an end. There is no further existence after this. This is the insight you have. This is the knowledge you have. That is what matters. That is what Buddhism ultimately is all about. So you start to see now that this is no small matter, the idea of rebirth. It is through and through these teachings. It is such an incredibly important part. In fact, I would say it's like if you have a house of cards, one of the foundation pillars in that house of cards is the rebirth card. Pull that out, everything collapses. There is no Buddhism without rebirth. It doesn't exist anymore. It cannot really, it gains an entirely new meaning. You have to redefine all the concepts, everything that is about. And that's why you come up, not with Buddhism, you come up with something else. Call it secular Buddhism, call it whatever you want, but it's not Buddhism anymore. And that's kind of fascinating. So my question then is, Well, if what I'm saying is true, then what are these secular Buddhists? Are they really Buddhist at all? If you reject rebirth, and rebirth is so foundational to the idea of Buddhism, can you really call yourself Buddhist? And if you can't call yourself Buddhist, they become just secular. You guys, you are secular. We're secular Buddhists. No, you're just secular, I think. You just have to call yourself secular. It doesn't sound as good, right? It doesn't have the same marketing power. Yeah, we are seculars. Secular Buddhist sounds kind of more, okay, there's some oomph to that. The secular doesn't really work. So I don't think they will accept that. And you may think, and you have some grounds for that, you may think, I don't have the right to define others, what they are. And to some extent, I agree with that. We shouldn't go around defining others. But at the same time, I would also argue that words have a meaning only in a certain context. Words have a meaning because they refer to something. And sometimes it is fair, I think, to say that, well, you are a fish because you swim in water and you have fins, and that's what you do. If you are running around in the forest and you look like a bear, you're not a fish. Right? If you start calling the bear a fish, we kind of, we stop being able to communicate at a certain point because words don't have any meaning anymore. And the same thing is true also for Buddhism. It has to have a certain meaning, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. And the idea here, of course, is that the idea of being a Buddhist, what it really means is that you take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. That is the meaning of being a Buddhist. And taking refuge really means that you take these teachings as your guidelines. It doesn't mean that you have to believe in absolutely everything for 100% certain, having no doubts or anything. It doesn't mean that. But you take them as a guideline. You take them seriously. You don't reject them out of hand. Because if you reject them out of hand, what you are essentially saying is that the Buddha was not awakened. And if you say the Buddha was not awakened, are you really a Buddhist, or are you something else? So it is very problematic, I would say. The idea of secular Buddhism is, to my mind, fundamentally flawed. And I would say to the secular Buddhist, if anyone is listening, check out the way that our society is changing. Check out the way we're moving. It is time to understand that we're going through a paradigm shift. The world is opening up in new ways. We don't need to hold on to materialism, to physicalism anymore. Things are actually happening in our world. And if you don't change your mind, you're going to be left behind. You're going to be left with an outdated view that does not fit with the latest scientific and philosophical evidence, nor are you going to have a view that fits with Buddhism. You're going to have nothing. That's bad. That's terrible. Isn't that terrible? And you're going to stand there on bare ground. You have nothing to hold on to anymore. And this, I think, is what's going to happen to these people unless they start to think. And I don't mean to say that you have done something terrible or anything like that. I'm just saying that you have done really well. You've done something positive. You have helped to bring Buddhism to the West. But please help us not to throw the baby with the bathwater. Please help all of us together to bring these teachings alive for the world's population, because these are very powerful and beautiful teachings. And if we don't stand together, understanding what really is the foundation of these teachings, if we split up too much and we have all kind of strange views, we're actually undermining these powerful teachings. We're giving them less power in the world and less ability to help people who are suffering and who are in trouble. So there you are. Maybe I should say a little bit about why it really matters. So only for a couple of minutes. I'm probably running out of time now. But just very, very briefly, why this matters so much. And the reason why it matters so much is because it changes our ideas of what is important in this world. If you have an idea of life going on after this one, if you read a book like After by Bruce Grayson, and you see the experience these people have, how they regret their actions on their deathbed, how they can kind of see that I'm actually now reaping the results of those actions, and they kind of feel terrible. I met a lady, a very, very interesting lady in Perth, who is more monastic than the monastics. I mean, she is just awesome, awesome lady. That's a real American term, isn't it? Awesome. Awesome. She's really awesome. And she lives a life that is very secluded on her little farm, just in a little cutie, meditates all the time, and obviously had some very profound insights into Buddhism. And she tells a story when she had like a near-death experience in her life. And she had some kind of very severe asthma attack or something like that, and she fell out of her bed. She was lying on the floor. She thought she was dying. And she was desperate to try to catch her breath, and she wasn't able to catch her breath. And then something happened. She thought in her mind, but I have these regrets. And she's this super good human being, right? A heart of gold. But we all have kind of little regrets that we have done, and no one is absolutely perfect. So she has a tiny, minute, minuscule, atomic, quarkish regret, right? A very, very small regret. And she thought, I can't die. I have to sort this out, first of all. I have unfinished business. And so because of that, she then kind of was able then gradually to, over half an hour or whatever, to gradually start breathing again, kind of very shallowly at first, but finally deeper and deeper until her lungs started to function again properly. And she said for her that was a very, very powerful experience because it showed her the power of kindness, the importance of living well in this world, Because if you don't live well, you come to your deathbed, you feel regret. That's what the worst thing the last thing you want to do on your deathbed is to feel regret. And this is the same thing you see in many of these near-death experiences, People having a sense of regret. People suddenly understanding what life actually is about something completely different. I used to think my life was about relationships and material things and status and all of these kind of things. But actually, no, it's not about that at all. Life is about our inner qualities, how we treat other people, whether we are kind to others, whether we have a sense of compassion, whether we are able to listen and understand the people around us, whether we have a heart of love or not. This is what life really is about. All this other stuff is kind of irrelevant. That is what you see on your deathbed. And if we are trapped in this world and we don't have that larger outlook, we lose that. And this is why so many people behave stupidly in this world. Isn't it terrible when you see people shooting each other and doing all kind of crazy things? I don't get angry with them. I just feel it's kind of sad because they have misunderstood the meaning of life. They are deluded. They don't understand the larger reality around them. If they did that, they would never do these things. And that comes from that insight into rebirth, the larger idea of life, what life really is about. And instead of just investing in this tiny little life we have here, which is over before you have it, sometimes I look at myself in the mirror, I think I was so young only yesterday. I'm going down the drain. Okay, John tells me I'm still young. I don't believe it. I don't think it's true. I'm not still young. It's maybe in comparison to some people, but it's all over pretty much. And life is so short. It is so quick. And then I realized the importance of these things, how we actually need to live in a different way. And you start to see that, actually, no, I should invest in my life in a way where I take into account this big panoramic view, this idea of life after life, going into the future. That is how I should invest my time, my resources, my efforts in this world. And when I do that, then I am living well. The majority of people only invest for this life. And because they invest for this life, material things are very important. Status is important. Relationships are important. But if you invest with a longer view of things, these things are secondary. What is really important is the quality of your heart. It is not what you get. It is how you get things in this world that matters. It is the inner way that we deal with people around us that actually is what really matters. And this is what this idea of rebirth, of understanding, dying, and all of these things in the right way, this is what it does to you if you think about it in the right way. It makes you a better person. Is there anyone here who does not want to be a better person? I'm glad, because otherwise I would have been it would have been bad news. I think everyone in the world wants to be a better person, right? Isn't that the case? Because we know intuitively that being a good person is happiness, is joy, right? We know that intuitively. So if we can help that out by thinking about life and death in the right way, it's wonderful. So I have now spoken for an hour, which I said I was. And I just want to congratulate the Theosophical Society for taking rebirth seriously, because that's exactly what I want to do. And I just wanted to remind people of the importance of this topic, because sometimes these very important things are underestimated in our contemporary culture, and I want to be someone who at least tries to kind of redress that imbalance.